The chains around my wrists cut into my skin as two tall creatures pulled me forward through a hallway that glowed faint green, like the inside of a giant insect nest. My name is Ethan Blake, and 3 hours ago, I was the communications officer on a small scouting ship called the Halden. Now I was the only one left. The others were gone. I did not let myself think about that word too much, because if I did, my legs would stop moving, and here, stopping meant something far worse. The creatures walking beside me stood taller than any human, their bodies covered in a hard shell that shifted color depending on the light. Their eyes were large and black, without any white showing, and their mouths clicked when they spoke to each other in a language full of sharp sounds. I had heard of them before, in old briefing files back on Earth. The Skarn Collective, an empire that had existed for longer than written human history, one that had never lost a single war against any species it had ever met. And I was walking straight into the middle of it. The hallway curved upward, and strange lights pulsed along the walls like a heartbeat. Every few steps I passed openings that led to rooms I could not see into, and from some of them came sounds that made my skin crawl, clicking and buzzing that almost sounded like whispers. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept my eyes forward, trying to look calm, even though calm was the last thing I felt. One of the guards beside me spoke into a small device on its shoulder. I could not understand the words, but I recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone reporting something up a chain of command. A moment later, the device crackled, and a different voice answered, higher and sharper. The guard's grip on my arm tightened slightly, and for the first time, I noticed something odd. Its hand was shaking. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe these creatures always moved like that. Maybe it was just how their muscles worked. But the more I looked, the more I saw it in the other guard too, a stiffness in the way it held its spear, like it was gripping something it was afraid to drop. We reached a set of massive doors, taller than any building I had seen on Earth, carved with symbols that seemed to move if I stared at them too long. The guards stopped in front of the doors and exchanged a few clicks between themselves. Then, slowly, the doors began to open, revealing a chamber so large it looked like it could hold an entire stadium. The room inside was filled with more of the insect-like creatures, standing in rows, all facing toward a raised platform at the far end. Soft light poured down from somewhere above, catching on their shells and making the whole room shimmer in shades of blue and green. It was beautiful in a strange, cold way, the kind of beauty that makes you feel very small and very unwelcome at the same time. I was pushed forward, my boots scraping against a floor so polished I could almost see my own reflection in it. Every eye in that room turned toward me, thousands of them. I felt like a piece of meat being carried to a table, and in a way, I suppose that was exactly what I was. As we moved closer to the platform, I noticed the creatures were not just watching me, they were watching me the way you might watch a predator that had somehow wandered into a crowded market. There was no anger in their eyes, not the way I expected from an enemy. There was something closer to caution, maybe even something closer to worry. I tried to push the thought away. It made no sense. I was one man in chains, unarmed, exhausted, surrounded by an army that could have ended my life with a single motion. There was nothing about me that should have made anyone in that room feel worried. The guard beside me grabbed my arm again to keep me walking straight, and as it did, the rough fabric of my sleeve caught on something, maybe a jagged piece of its armor, and tore clean up to my elbow. I barely noticed at first. My mind was too busy trying not to panic. But then I felt cool air against my skin where the fabric had been, and I looked down. There, running from my wrist to just below my elbow, was an old scar, pale, thin in some places and thicker in others, curving slightly like a long, crooked line drawn by an unsteady hand. I had carried that scar for years. It was so old and so familiar to me that I usually forgot it was even there. It was just a part of my arm, something that had happened a long time ago in a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away from this one. But something changed the instant that scar became visible. The room, which had already been quiet except for the low hum of the lights and the soft clicking of alien voices, fell into complete silence. Not the kind of silence that happens when a room is simply quiet. This was the kind of silence that happens when hundreds of people stop breathing at the same time. I looked up, confused, and saw every single creature in that massive chamber staring directly at my arm. Not at my face, not at the chains around my wrists, at the scar. One of the guards holding me let out a sharp click, almost like a gasp, and took a step back, pulling its hand away from my arm as if it had suddenly become too hot to touch. The other guard's spear, the long weapon it had been gripping tightly since the moment they took me, slipped from its claws and clattered against the polished floor with a sound that echoed through the entire chamber like a gunshot. No one moved to pick it up. I stood there, frozen, chains hanging loose around my wrists, my torn sleeve fluttering slightly from some hidden airflow in the ceiling, and I had absolutely no idea what was happening. My scar was nothing special. I remembered getting it. I remembered exactly how ordinary the story behind it was. There was no way something so plain could mean anything to a species that had never even heard of Earth until a few years ago. And yet, all around me, spears were falling. One after another, the sound echoed through the chamber, clatter after clatter, as more and more of the guards lining the walls loosened their grip and let their weapons hit the floor. Some of them backed away entirely, pressing themselves against the walls as if trying to put as much distance between themselves and me as possible. Others dropped to their knees, lowering their heads in a gesture I did not understand, but recognized instantly as something close to fear, or maybe something close to reverence, perhaps both at once. At the far end of the chamber, on the raised platform, something stirred. A tall figure that had been sitting motionless since I entered the room began to rise. It was larger than any of the other creatures around it, its shell a deep shade of violet that seemed to shift and glow faintly under the lights above. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost careful, the way someone might move if they were not entirely sure the ground beneath them was solid. Every creature in the room turned toward the platform, and a murmur ran through the crowd, a wave of soft clicking sounds that spread from one end of the chamber to the other like ripples across water. I did not know it yet, but I was looking at the Queen of the Skarn Collective, a being who had not stood from that throne in longer than any record in this ship could measure, and she was staring straight at my arm with an expression I could not read, but one that sent a cold, sharp feeling straight through my chest. Whatever was happening, whatever my scar meant to these creatures, I understood one thing with complete certainty in that moment. This was no longer a simple matter of being a prisoner brought before an alien ruler for judgment. Something about that scar had changed everything, and I had absolutely no idea how, or why, or what would happen next. The guards nearest to me shuffled back another step, leaving a wide, empty circle around where I stood, chains hanging loose, sleeve torn, heart hammering against my ribs. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of the Queen's footsteps as she began, slowly, to walk down from her platform. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind racing through every possible explanation and finding none of them satisfying. All I could do was stand there, exposed and confused, waiting to find out what kind of storm I had just wandered into. The Queen reached the bottom of the platform and stopped there for a moment, as if gathering herself before taking another step. Around her, the guards who still held their spears lowered them slightly, not in attack, but in something closer to submission. I had never seen a room full of armed soldiers behave this way, not once in my entire life, and the strangeness of it made my skin prickle with unease. She began walking toward me, each step slow and careful, her long limbs moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural for something so large. Her shell caught the light in shifting patterns of violet and deep blue, and the closer she came, the more I could see fine markings etched across her body, patterns that looked almost like writing, though I could not begin to guess what they meant. I stood perfectly still. Running was not an option, not with guards still lining every wall, and even if it had been, my legs felt frozen in place anyway. All I could do was wait and try to keep my breathing steady, though my heart was doing anything but that. When she was close enough that I could see my own reflection in her large dark eyes, she stopped. For a long moment, neither of us moved. She studied my face first, tilting her head slightly in a motion that reminded me, oddly, of a bird examining something unfamiliar. Then her gaze dropped again to my arm, to the scar running along my forearm, and she stayed there for what felt like an eternity. A small device floated down from somewhere near the ceiling, hovering close to her shoulder. It looked like a small metal sphere with a single blinking light on its surface. I recognized it immediately as some kind of translator, similar to devices Earth scientists had built for early contact situations, though far more advanced. When she finally spoke, her voice came through the device in a tone that was flat and mechanical, stripped of whatever emotion might have been in her original words, yet somehow the fear behind it still managed to come through. Her first question was simple, and it was the last thing I expected to hear. "Are you one of them?" I blinked, completely lost. One of who? I had no idea what she meant, and judging by the way every creature in that chamber seemed to hold its breath waiting for my answer, this was clearly not a question anyone expected me to misunderstand. I decided the safest thing to do was tell the truth, since I genuinely had no idea what lie could possibly help me here. "I do not understand the question," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "My name is Ethan Blake. I am a human from a planet called Earth. I do not know what you are asking me." The Queen's head tilted again, and this time a ripple of whispers spread through the guards standing closest to us. She raised one long clawed hand and gestured toward my arm without touching it, as if even getting close to the scar made her uneasy. "That mark," she said through the device, her mechanical voice unable to hide the weight behind the words. "Where did you receive that mark?" I looked down at my own arm, at the pale, curving line I had carried for so long that I barely thought about it anymore. It felt strange, almost embarrassing, to explain something so ordinary to a being who seemed to be looking at it like it was the most important thing in the entire universe. "I got this a long time ago," I said. "Back when I was training to become a pilot, there was an accident during a simulation exercise. A support beam gave way and cut my arm before I could get clear. It has been there ever since. It is nothing special, just an old accident." The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted in the room. I could not quite explain what it was, but the tension seemed to thicken rather than ease. The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, and she exchanged a quick glance with one of the taller guards standing near the platform, a creature with markings different from the others, deeper red streaks running along its shell. That guard stepped forward and spoke rapidly to the Queen in their clicking language. I could not understand a single word, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost pleading. The Queen raised a hand, and the guard fell silent immediately, though its posture remained rigid with what I could only describe as barely controlled alarm. The Queen turned back to me, her large dark eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, though something told me looking away might be the worst thing I could do in this moment. "You say this was an accident," she said slowly, testing each word as if she did not quite believe them. "A simple accident, from your training, with no meaning beyond the moment it happened." "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what I am telling you." She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I began to wonder if the translator device had stopped working. The silence in the chamber remained absolute, thousands of creatures standing motionless, watching this exchange unfold with a kind of tension that felt like it could snap at any second. Finally, the Queen spoke again, her voice this time carrying a strange mixture of caution and something that almost sounded like disbelief. "There is a story among my people," she said, "older than any living memory, passed down through generations since before even I was born. A story about beings who came to us long ago, carrying marks exactly like the one on your arm. Beings who fought against impossible odds and refused to yield, even when every reasonable measure suggested they should have fallen." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. I had no idea what she was talking about, but the way every guard in that room reacted to her words told me this was not some minor legend. This was something much bigger, something that had shaped the way an entire empire thought about creatures like me. "We call them the Scarred Ones," the Queen continued, her mechanical voice unable to fully hide the tension behind the words. "It is said that no weapon could stop them, that no army could break their will, and that any who dared to face them found only ruin waiting on the other side. For generations, my people have told this story as a warning to our young, a reminder of what happens when we underestimate those who appear weak. I stood there, chains hanging loose around my wrists, completely stunned into silence. Of all the things I had imagined might happen when I was dragged before an alien queen, being mistaken for some kind of legendary warrior from an ancient story had never once crossed my mind. "And you believe I am one of these scarred ones?" I said carefully, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice, though I doubt I succeeded entirely. The queen studied me for another long moment, her eyes moving from my face down to my arm and back again, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been taught since childhood. "I do not know what to believe," she admitted finally. "It has been many generations since anyone claimed to see such a mark. Most among my people believed the scarred ones were nothing more than old stories, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. And yet here you stand, carrying the exact mark described in every version of that story I have ever heard." The red-marked guard beside the platform spoke up again, this time loud enough that I could hear the sharp edge in its clicking voice, even without understanding the words. The queen turned toward it, and for a moment the two exchanged words rapidly, their tones rising with what felt like genuine disagreement. Finally, the queen raised a hand again, silencing the guard, though its posture remained stiff with clear frustration. "General Korath does not believe your presence here is anything more than coincidence," the queen said, turning back to me. "He believes I am allowing old superstition to cloud my judgment in front of my own soldiers. He is not entirely wrong to question this. It is a serious accusation to make, and an even more serious mistake to make incorrectly." I said nothing, unsure what response could possibly help my situation at this point. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything I had just learned. An ancient legend about warriors with scars like mine, an empire that had never lost a war, suddenly gripped by uncertainty over a single human prisoner, a general who clearly wanted to dismiss the entire situation and likely deal with me the way any ordinary prisoner might expect to be dealt with. The queen studied me a moment longer, then turned to address the entire chamber, her voice carrying now, amplified somehow, so that every creature in that massive room could hear her clearly. "We will not act in haste," she declared, her mechanical voice steady, despite the tension still hanging thick in the air. "This matter requires understanding before it requires judgment. I will speak with this human further, in private, before any decision is made regarding his fate." A murmur spread through the crowd, some sounds that felt like approval, others that felt closer to unease. The general, Korath, stood rigid near the platform, clearly displeased with this decision, but unwilling to challenge his queen openly in front of the entire assembly. Guards moved forward to escort me, though this time their movements were far more careful than before, almost respectful in a way that felt entirely foreign given the circumstances just an hour earlier. As I was led out of the massive chamber, following behind the queen towards some private section of the ship, I caught one last glimpse of General Korath watching me with an expression that needed no translation at all. Whatever happened next, I understood one thing with complete clarity. That general was not going to let this matter rest quietly, and somehow I had a feeling my next few hours were about to become far more complicated than anything I had faced since being dragged onto this ship in the first place. The private chamber the queen led me to was smaller than the massive hall, though it still dwarfed any room I had ever stood in back on Earth. The walls curved upward into a high ceiling, and soft light spilled from unseen sources, casting everything in a gentle blue glow. A handful of guards remained near the entrance, but they kept their distance, standing far enough back that their presence felt more like formality than actual watchfulness. The queen settled onto a raised seat near the center of the room, gesturing for me to sit on a low bench across from her. My chains had been loosened slightly, enough that I could move my arms without discomfort, though I noticed the guards near the door, watching that particular detail very closely. For a long moment, she simply studied me in silence, her large dark eyes moving slowly over my face, as if searching for something she could not quite name. When she finally spoke again, her voice through the translator device carried a weight that had not been there before, something closer to genuine curiosity mixed with old, deep unease. "I will tell you the story as it has been passed down to me," she said, "and I ask that you listen carefully, because much may depend on what you say once I am finished." I nodded, saying nothing, though my mind was already racing with questions I knew I would need to hold back for now. Many generations ago, long before I was born, before even my mother's mother sat upon this throne, my people encountered your kind for the very first time, the Queen began. "We did not know then that your species called itself human. We simply knew that a small vessel had drifted into a region of space we controlled, a vessel far smaller than anything we had ever bothered sending soldiers to intercept." She paused, her clawed fingers tracing a slow pattern along the arm of her seat, as if the memory, even second-hand, carried some discomfort with it. "It was not a warship," she continued. "Our scouts reported it as something closer to what your people might call a lifeboat, a small craft carrying only a handful of survivors. There had been, we later learned, an attack on one of your settlements, though the details of who committed that attack were never made entirely clear to us. What mattered to my ancestors at the time was simple. A weak, damaged vessel had entered our territory, and it seemed like an easy matter to bring its occupants in for questioning." I felt my chest tighten, already sensing where this story was heading, though I still could not fully picture how it connected to me sitting here, chained, in a room on the other side of the galaxy from everything I had ever known. "The soldiers sent to retrieve that vessel expected no resistance," the Queen said, "and yet, when they boarded, they found something they had never encountered before. A small number of your people, injured, exhausted, carrying wounds that should have left them barely able to stand, and yet they fought, not with weapons that matched ours in size or power, but with a determination that our soldiers had simply never faced before." Her voice, even filtered through the flat tone of the translator, seemed to carry something close to reluctant respect. "Many of my people did not survive that encounter," she said. "Entire units sent to retrieve a handful of wounded survivors returned broken, if they returned at all. It became clear, very quickly, that these were not ordinary prisoners to be handled with ordinary methods. When my ancestors finally managed to overcome them, and I will admit the stories vary greatly in how that outcome was achieved, they noted one thing above all else. Every single one of those survivors carried marks upon their bodies. Old wounds, scars from battles fought long before that day, wounds that had not stopped them from continuing to resist, even when logic suggested resistance was impossible. I sat in silence, trying to imagine that scene. A handful of desperate, wounded people fighting off soldiers from an empire that had never known defeat. It felt like something out of an old story told around a fire, not something connected to any history I recognized from Earth's own records. But then again, Earth's history was long, and not every chapter of it had been written down carefully, especially not the chapters involving early encounters with unknown dangers from beyond our own solar system. "From that day forward," the Queen continued, "my people began telling the story of the Scarred Ones. Not as history exactly, though it began as history. Over many generations, it became something closer to legend, a lesson taught to young soldiers before they ever set foot on a battlefield. Do not assume weakness based on size. Do not assume surrender based on injury. Somewhere among the stars, there exist beings who wear their wounds not as weakness, but as proof that they cannot be stopped." She leaned forward slightly, her large eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made it difficult to look away. "And then, after all these generations, after most among my people had come to believe this was nothing more than an old tale meant to frighten young soldiers into caution, a scouting vessel captures a human, and that human carries a mark identical to the one described in every version of that ancient story. I finally understood, with complete clarity, exactly what kind of situation I had stumbled into. This was not simply a matter of alien superstition, mistaking an ordinary scar for something meaningful. This was an empire's entire military culture, built partly around the memory of one desperate encounter, suddenly confronted with what appeared to be living proof that the legend was real. "I need to be honest with you," I said carefully, choosing my words slowly. "I do not know anything about that story you just told me. My scar came from a training accident, exactly as I described before. I am not some legendary warrior. I am a communications officer. I do not even know how to properly use most of the weapons on my own ship, let alone fight the way you are describing." The Queen studied me for a long moment after I finished speaking, and I braced myself, half expecting her expression, whatever passed for expression on a creature like her, to shift into anger or disappointment. Instead, something far more complicated crossed her features, something that looked almost like conflict. "I believe you may be telling the truth," she said finally. "And yet, I must also consider what happens if you are not entirely correct about your own nature. Perhaps you are not one of the original scarred ones from that ancient encounter, but perhaps your people, all of your kind, carry within them something similar to what my ancestors witnessed that day. Perhaps the scar itself is not the source of the danger, but simply a marker of it." I opened my mouth to argue, to insist again that I was nothing special, just an ordinary man who had gotten unlucky enough to end up on this ship. But something stopped me before the words could leave my mouth. I thought about the guards dropping their spears the instant my sleeve tore. I thought about General Korath's barely restrained fury, and the fear beneath that fury. I thought about an entire empire that had never lost a war, suddenly hesitating over what to do with a single unarmed prisoner, simply because of an old scar and an older story. And I thought about the other members of my scouting team, the ones who had not survived the initial encounter with the Skarn ships. I thought about my ship's captain, a woman named Laura Finch, who had ordered me to the escape pod before the rest of the vessel had been overwhelmed, buying me the time I needed to get away, even though she herself had not made it out. If this legend, however exaggerated or misunderstood, could buy me even a small amount of leverage in this situation, was it really wrong to use it? I was not lying to the Queen. Everything I had told her about my scar was completely true. If she and her people chose to interpret that truth through the lens of their own ancient fears, was that truly my responsibility to correct, especially when correcting it might mean losing the only advantage I currently had? "I understand your uncertainty," I said slowly, testing the weight of each word before I let it leave my mouth. "I cannot tell you with certainty what my people are capable of, because I do not know the full history of everything my ancestors have done, any more than you know the full history of everything yours have done. But I can tell you this: I do not intend to cause harm to anyone here, provided no harm is intended toward me." It was a careful answer, honest in its own way, while still leaving enough uncertainty hanging in the air to keep the legend alive in the Queen's mind. I watched her expression carefully, trying to gauge whether the answer had helped or hurt my situation. She was quiet for a long moment, her clawed fingers once again tracing that same slow pattern along the arm of her seat. Finally, she rose from her seat, moving toward a section of the wall that shimmered slightly, revealing what looked like a window looking out into open space, countless stars scattered across an endless dark canvas. "There are others of your kind aboard this vessel," she said without turning to face me. "Captured from a separate encounter several days before your own vessel was discovered. I had intended to have them processed, according to standard procedure, before this situation with your scar arose. Now, I find myself questioning what standard procedure should even mean, given everything I have just told you." My heart nearly stopped in my chest. Other humans, alive, aboard this ship, possibly close enough that I might be able to help them if I played this situation correctly. I kept my voice as steady as I could manage, though inside, my mind was already racing through every possible way I might use this new information. "If there are others of my people here," I said carefully, "then their safety matters a great deal to me. I would ask that no harm come to them while you and I continue this conversation." The Queen turned back to face me, her large dark eyes studying my expression with a look that told me she understood exactly what I was doing, even if she could not be entirely certain whether my concern was genuine care for my own kind or simply another calculated move in whatever game she believed I might be playing. "We will discuss their fate," she said finally, "along with your own, once I have consulted further with my council. General Korath will not be pleased with further delay, and I suspect he will make his displeasure known before this matter is settled." As if summoned by his own name, The doors to the private chamber slid open, and General Korath himself stepped inside, his red-marked shell catching the soft blue light in a way that made him look even more imposing than he had back in the main hall. His dark eyes fixed on me immediately, and I could see, even without understanding a single word of his language, that whatever patience he had shown earlier had completely run out. He began speaking rapidly to the Queen, his voice sharp and urgent even through the muffled distance of the translator device, and though I could not understand the words themselves, the meaning behind them needed no translation at all. Whatever careful balance I had managed to strike in this conversation so far, I had a sinking feeling it was about to be tested far more severely than anything I had faced since these chains were first placed around my wrists. General Korath's voice filled the chamber, sharp and rapid, and though the words meant nothing to me, the anger behind them was unmistakable. The Queen listened without interrupting, her posture calm, though I noticed the slight tension in the way she held her shoulders, a sign that even she was not entirely comfortable with whatever the general was demanding. Finally, she raised a hand, and Korath fell silent, though his dark eyes remained fixed on me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The Queen turned toward me, her mechanical translated voice carrying a note of something close to apology, though I doubted a creature like her felt the need to apologize to a prisoner very often. General Korath believes this entire matter has already gone on far too long, she said. He argues that a true scarred one, if such a thing truly exists, would have no need to sit quietly and discuss terms. He believes your calm demeanor proves you are nothing more than an ordinary human attempting to use an old legend for your own benefit. I felt my stomach drop, though I kept my expression as steady as I could manage. Korath was not wrong, not exactly, and the fact that he had guessed so close to the truth without any real evidence told me he was far sharper than I had given him credit for back in the main hall. I said nothing for a long moment, weighing my options carefully. Denying his accusation outright would likely only confirm it further in his eyes. Admitting to it would end whatever leverage I currently had instantly, and possibly put both myself and the other captured humans in far greater danger than we already were. I decided the only path forward was to hold steady, to let my actions speak louder than any argument I could make with words. If the general believes calm behavior disproves the legend, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, then perhaps he misunderstands what made the scarred ones dangerous in the first place. Fear makes people reckless. Confidence makes people patient. I have no reason to act with panic in a room I do not currently believe intends to harm me without cause. The Queen's eyes flicked toward Korath, gauging his reaction, and I could see the general's shell shift slightly, a subtle ripple of color that I was beginning to recognize as a sign of genuine frustration among these creatures. He responded with another burst of sharp clicking words, gesturing toward me with one clawed hand, and this time the Queen's expression shifted into something more serious as she listened. He proposes a test, she said finally, turning back to me, her tone carrying a weight that told me whatever came next would matter a great deal. He believes that if you are truly what the old stories describe, you should be able to demonstrate some proof beyond simply carrying a similar mark and speaking with confidence. My mind raced immediately, trying to imagine what kind of test an alien general might consider reasonable proof of some ancient legendary bloodline. Whatever it was, I had a sinking feeling it would not be something as simple as answering another question calmly. "What kind of test?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing knot of tension forming in my chest. The Queen hesitated before answering, and that hesitation alone told me the answer was not going to be pleasant. "He proposes a trial of endurance," she said finally. "A demonstration meant to separate old legend from ordinary prisoner. It is not without precedent among my people, though I will admit it has rarely been used on a captive so newly brought aboard this vessel." Korath spoke again, his tone sharper this time, and the Queen's expression tightened slightly before she translated his words further. "He wishes for you to face a single combat trial against one of our trained soldiers, unarmed, under controlled conditions," she explained. "Not to the point of serious harm, he insists, merely enough to demonstrate whether the resilience described in the old stories exists within you, or whether it exists only within your words. I felt a cold wave of dread settle over me. I was no soldier. I had spent my career on a ship managing communication systems and navigation logs, not training for combat against creatures built with natural armor and claws sharp enough to tear through metal. Whatever the general considered a controlled trial, I doubted very much that it would feel controlled from where I would be standing. And yet, refusing outright would almost certainly confirm every doubt Korath already held. If I backed away from this challenge now, whatever fragile advantage I still held over my situation, and over the safety of the other captured humans somewhere aboard this ship, would collapse instantly. I thought again of Captain Finch, of the way she had shoved me toward that escape pod without a single moment of hesitation, sacrificing her own chance at survival so that I might have mine. I thought of the other humans still trapped somewhere aboard this vessel, waiting for a fate that depended entirely on decisions being made in this room right now. I straightened my shoulders as best I could despite the chain still hanging loosely around my wrists, and I forced my voice to remain steady, even as my heart pounded hard enough that I was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "I will accept the trial," I said, and Korath's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had expected me to refuse and was recalculating his own assumptions on the spot. The Queen studied me for a long moment, her large dark eyes carrying an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between concern and cautious approval. "Very well," she said finally. "The trial will take place in the training arena within this vessel. I will oversee the proceedings myself, alongside General Korath, and I will ensure the conditions remain as controlled as such a trial allows." We moved through another set of winding corridors, guards falling into step around us, though their formation felt different now, less like an escort for a dangerous prisoner and more like witnesses gathering for an event they were uncertain how to feel about. Word of what was happening seemed to spread quickly, and by the time we reached the training arena, a circular room with high walls lined with strange padded material, a small crowd of soldiers had already gathered along the upper platforms overlooking the space. Korath stepped into the arena first, removing a heavy piece of outer armor from his shoulders, revealing muscular limbs beneath his shell that made my earlier fear feel entirely justified. He rolled his neck slightly, a gesture that needed no translation, and fixed his dark eyes on me with an expression that made it clear he still believed, deep down, that this entire situation was going to end with my quiet, humiliating defeat. I stepped into the arena as well, my chains finally removed entirely, leaving my arms free, but also leaving me acutely aware of just how unprotected I truly was. The old scar on my forearm felt strangely heavy in that moment, as if the weight of an ancient legend I had no real claim to was somehow pressing down against my skin. The Queen's voice carried across the arena, amplified once again by whatever system controlled these announcements throughout the ship. "This trial is not meant to end in serious harm," she declared, her tone carrying clear authority despite the uncertainty I could sense underneath it. "It is meant only to determine truth from assumption. General Korath, you may begin when ready." Korath did not hesitate. He moved forward with a speed that caught me completely off guard, faster than his size should have reasonably allowed, and I barely managed to twist out of the way as one powerful arm swept through the space where I had been standing only a heartbeat earlier. I stumbled back, my breathing already ragged, adrenaline flooding through my body in a way that made every second feel stretched impossibly long. I had no training for this, no experience facing an opponent built for exactly this kind of confrontation. All I had was desperation, and the faint, flickering hope that desperation alone might be enough to see me through the next few minutes. Korath pressed forward again, and this time I could not fully avoid the impact. A glancing blow against my shoulder that sent a sharp burst of pain through my arm and knocked me off balance entirely. I hit the floor hard, the wind momentarily knocked from my lungs, and for a moment, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether I would rise again or stay down. I thought of the old scar on my arm, of the mundane accident that had put it there, and of the strange twist of fate that had somehow transformed that ordinary mark into a symbol of something far greater in the eyes of an entire alien empire. And I thought, with sudden clarity, that perhaps the legend had never truly been about supernatural strength or impossible endurance at all. Perhaps it had simply been about refusing to stay down, even when every reasonable measure suggested that staying down was the only sensible choice remaining. I pushed myself back up onto my feet, ignoring the sharp protest of pain radiating from my shoulder, and faced Korath again, my legs shaking slightly, but my eyes steady and unblinking. A murmur rippled through the crowd gathered along the upper platforms, and even Korath himself paused for a brief moment, his dark eyes studying me with an expression that had shifted, just slightly, from confident certainty toward something closer to genuine uncertainty. Whatever happened in the next few moments, I understood that this trial was no longer simply about proving or disproving an ancient legend. It had become something far more personal, a test not of who I truly was according to some old story, but of what I was willing to endure for the sake of the people still depending on me, both aboard this ship and back on a planet that had no idea just how close its fate might currently hang in the balance. Korath circled me slowly now, his earlier confidence tempered by whatever he had seen in my eyes when I rose back to my feet. The crowd along the upper platforms had grown quieter, the earlier murmurs settling into something closer to tense anticipation. I kept my breathing steady, or as steady as I could manage, and watched his movements carefully, trying to anticipate whatever came next. He lunged again, faster this time, and I barely managed to sidestep the attack, feeling the rush of air as his arm passed close to my ribs. I stumbled slightly on the recovery, my legs still unsteady from the earlier fall, and Korath used the opening to close the distance further, forcing me back toward the padded wall of the arena. I felt my shoulder blades press against the wall, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought this was where the trial would end, with me cornered and unable to demonstrate whatever proof Korath believed the old legend required. But then something shifted in my mind, a realization that had been building since the moment I first stood back up after being knocked down. This was never a fight I could win through strength or skill, because I simply did not have either in any measure that could match a trained Skarn soldier. If there was any chance of ending this trial in a way that protected both myself and the other captured humans, it would not come from my fists or my footwork. It would come from understanding exactly what this trial was truly meant to prove and finding a way to prove it on my own terms instead of Korath's. I raised my hands, not in a fighting stance, but open, empty, a clear gesture of pause rather than aggression. Korath hesitated, his arm drawn back but not yet moving forward, clearly confused by a posture that did not match anything he expected from an opponent mid-trial. "I am not going to keep striking back at you," I said, loud enough that my voice carried across the arena, loud enough that I hoped the Queen watching from above could hear every word clearly through whatever translation system was capturing this exchange. Not because I cannot try, but because I do not believe that is truly what this trial is meant to measure. Korath's stance shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering behind his dark eyes, though he did not lower his raised arm entirely. "You believe the old story is about strength," I continued, forcing steadiness into my voice, despite the ragged edge of my breathing. "About warriors who could not be harmed, who fought without fear, because pain simply did not touch them the way it touches ordinary beings. But that is not what a scar actually represents. A scar is proof that something did cause harm, that the pain was real, that the wound was real, and that whoever carries it kept moving forward anyway, not because they were unstoppable, but because stopping was never something they were willing to choose." The arena had grown almost completely silent now, the crowd along the upper platforms watching with an intensity that made the air feel thick and heavy. Even Korath had lowered his arm slightly, his shell shifting through subtle patterns of color that I could not fully interpret, though the aggression in his posture had clearly softened into something closer to genuine consideration. "I am not a legendary warrior," I said, my voice steady now, carrying a conviction that surprised even me. "I am an ordinary person who happened to survive an accident, exactly as I told your queen from the very beginning. But if your ancestors truly encountered beings who fought against impossible odds despite carrying real wounds, real pain, and real fear, then perhaps what made them dangerous was never some special strength written into their bodies. Perhaps it was simply their refusal to let any of that stop them from protecting the people who depended on them." I glanced up toward the platform where the Queen stood watching, her large, dark eyes fixed intently on me, her expression carrying an unreadable mixture of emotions that I could not begin to fully decipher. "That is not something unique to whatever legend your people remember," I continued, turning my attention back to Korath, whose stance had shifted further, the aggressive readiness draining slowly from his posture. "Every single one of my people carries that same capacity within them, not because we are special, but because it is simply part of what it means to care about something enough to keep fighting for it, even when the odds suggest we should not bother trying." For a long moment, nobody moved. Korath stood frozen, his dark eyes searching my face for something, though I could not tell whether he was looking for weakness or looking for confirmation of exactly the opposite. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the arena's lighting system and the soft shuffle of the crowd shifting uneasily along the upper platforms. Finally, the Queen's voice rang out, clear and firm, cutting through the tension that had settled over the entire chamber. "The trial is concluded," she declared, and the finality in her tone left no room for argument, not even from Korath, whose posture stiffened briefly before settling into something closer to reluctant acceptance. Korath stepped back, lowering his arms fully, his dark eyes never leaving my face even as the tension between us finally began to ease. He said nothing directly to me, but he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt, even without translation, like a small measure of grudging respect. The Queen descended from the platform overlooking the arena, moving with the same slow, deliberate grace I had noticed since our very first meeting, and stopped in front of me, studying my face carefully. "You did not fight as Korath expected," she said, her mechanical voice carrying a note of something close to quiet approval. "And yet you have proven something that I believe matters far more than any test of physical endurance ever could." I said nothing, waiting, my heart still pounding from the trial, though the fear that had gripped me earlier had settled into something calmer, steadier. "The old legend of the Scarred Ones was never truly about supernatural strength," the Queen continued, echoing the very point I had made moments earlier. "I believe, perhaps, my people forgot that truth somewhere across the many generations this story has been retold. You have reminded us of something we should never have allowed ourselves to forget." She turned to address the gathered crowd along the upper platforms, her voice carrying clearly across the arena once again. "This human will not be held as a prisoner," she declared, and a wave of murmurs spread through the assembled soldiers, though none of them dared to voice open disagreement given everything they had just witnessed. "Nor will the other humans currently held aboard this vessel. They will be released, along with safe passage back toward their own territory." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that my knees nearly buckled beneath me, though I forced myself to remain standing, keeping whatever composure I still had intact for just a little longer. "I have one further request," I said, and the Queen turned back toward me, waiting. "Information regarding any fleet movements currently planned toward my people's home world. If there is genuine reason for continued conflict between our peoples, I would rather see that conflict avoided entirely, if such a thing remains possible." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, considering my request carefully. Finally, she nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "I will provide what information I am able to share," she said, "and I will personally recommend, before my full council, that further hostilities toward your people be reconsidered, given everything that has transpired here today. I cannot promise this recommendation will be accepted without resistance, particularly from those among my people who still hold to older, more aggressive traditions. But I will make the argument, and I believe, after today, it will carry more weight than it might have carried yesterday." Over the following hours, I was reunited with the other captured humans, 4 exhausted but otherwise unharmed crew members, from a separate scouting vessel that had been intercepted days before my own encounter. Their relief at seeing another human face and at hearing that release, rather than further imprisonment awaited them, was almost overwhelming to witness. We were led to a small transport vessel, provided by the Scarn themselves, along with supplies and navigational data that would guide us safely back toward the outer edge of human-controlled space. Before boarding, the Queen approached me one final time, her large, dark eyes studying my face with an expression that had shifted, somewhere across the events of that day, from cautious suspicion into something that felt, unexpectedly, like genuine respect. "Whatever the old stories claimed about the scarred ones," she said quietly, the translator device carrying her words with unusual softness, "I believe the truth you showed me today matters far more. Perhaps that truth will serve both our peoples better than any legend ever could." I did not have a perfect response to offer her, so I simply nodded, extending as much sincerity as I could manage through a single gesture. As our transport vessel pulled away from the massive Skarn ship, drifting slowly out into open space before finally aligning its course toward home, I found myself staring down at the old scar still marking my forearm, pale and familiar, exactly as it had always been. It was strange to think that something so ordinary, a simple accident from years ago that I barely thought about most days, had somehow become tangled up with an ancient legend belonging to an empire that had never once lost a war in 10,000 years. Stranger still to think that the true lesson buried within that old legend had never truly been about strength or invincibility at all, but about something far simpler and far more human. The refusal to stop, even when every reasonable measure suggests stopping would be the easier choice. I leaned back in my seat, watching the stars stretch out ahead of us through the small viewport, and allowed myself, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, a small, tired smile. Somewhere out among those same stars, an empire that had never known defeat was now reconsidering everything it believed about the beings it once dismissed as weak and insignificant. And somewhere much closer to home, 5 ordinary humans were finally heading back toward the lives they had feared, only hours earlier, they might never see again. Whatever legends the future might tell about this day, I already knew the only truth that truly mattered. We had not been saved by some ancient supernatural bloodline, nor by strength that set us apart from every other living thing in the galaxy. We had simply refused to stay down, and sometimes, against all odds, that refusal alone is more than enough to change everything.